All right, everybody. But wait, there's more. I've just had a failed attempt at interviewing Professor Peter Gell. We had internet troubles. Well, first we had computer troubles. And then he switched from his laptop across to a phone, and then we had phone troubles. And then he switched from his phone to another laptop. And actually, when I tested it, that was working really, really well. The problem is I couldn't restart the same broadcast. I have to start a new broadcast, which is an absolute pain in the butt. However, I've done that. I've sent him the login link via email to his wife's computer because he's using his wife's computer now. And fingers crossed, with a little bit of luck, he's going to be joining me any minute. I'm sitting here watching, waiting in the green room. No one has arrived yet, but Professor Peter Gell should be showing up on a brand new laptop, not a brand new laptop, but on a different laptop that was working. We were chatting after the other stream. He jumped in and he sent me a message, and I didn't see the message in time. So unfortunately, I ended the other stream. I've had to start a new one instead of continuing the other one. I'm crossing my fingers and hoping like mad. I've sent him the login to get into this one, but I can assure you that the new laptop was working a lot better than either his phone or his other laptop. So guys, thank you for your patience. This has been ridiculous. Thank you all for coming back. I really do appreciate that. I was thinking everyone's just already gone off to do something else for tonight. So guys, I really appreciate you sticking around. We are going to get Professor Gell on. In fact, he's coming into the green room right now. I've just got to wait for his computer to finish loading. Here we go. How are we doing?
I'm not sure.
Mate,
I'll cross my fingers.
No. This is the clearest. This is the clearest that we have heard and seen you all night. So this is a really, really, really good sign. Okay. Look, I'm not going to make you repeat where we were. If for those of you that are, in a week's time, in a month's time, in a year's time, you're just watching this now, you're like, what the hell's going on? I don't understand. We're not going to go right back to the start of Professor Peter Gell's story. And should I be saying Gell or Gel?
Gel, soft G, yeah.
My apology. We're not going to go right back to the start of Professor Peter Gell's story. I'm going to let him pick up from where he was. There is a half-hour slow chat that is mostly made up of us trying to troubleshoot technology. Yeah, okay. So this is where the real chat is going to happen. So Professor Gell, please continue.
So let me move along. I was in France with a group from worked with people from the UK, US, Canada, and elsewhere, working on these algae that are indicative of salinity conditions, and they preserve in sediments so we can reconstruct salinity over time. And the person I was working with, Francois Gas, was world recognised for doing this sort of work, particularly in Africa, subsequently China, and colleagues in the US and UK were doing similar things in salt lake systems in Spain, Southern Europe, Canada, North America, elsewhere, and increasingly South America. So it's a worldwide program of this sort of paleoecological technology. And I subsequently went and worked in the UK doing some work on diatoms as indicators of pollution in rivers and elsewhere. But by and large, I came back from France to take up a scholarship to finish up a PhD at Monash University.
Okay.
And to start that, I collected a core which is famous as being core LA2 from Flinders University. But I did a preliminary study of that, and it wasn't giving me the sorts of stories I was after. So I ended up working on crater lakes in Western Victoria. But the work on modern diatoms went from anywhere from Geelong right the way up to Mildura. So I studied most of the lakes of Western Victoria.
Okay.
And in those days of completing your PhD, and my wife was completing her master's, we were thinking of very nice.
Okay, yes. Good little drop, this one. Good little drop.
I've tried Abalua before.
Yeah.
We were contemplating moving to the UK. She's English.
Okay.
But on the day she was setting back to the UK, I got an offer to work at Adelaide University. So over breakfast, we had to decide which hemisphere we were going to live in. And I stopped applying for jobs in the UK and for permits, and she had to start applying for residency in Australia. So
Well,
That's
look,
what happens.
it's impressive that she didn't just turn around and say, "Well, it looks like we're living in two different hemispheres, mate."
Yes. Well, her residency or her permit, actually, we got that a day before we flew back to Australia. So
Oh,
it
wow.
was all a closely run thing. But anyway,
Goodness.
we set up in Adelaide, and that was fairly tense for the first few years, but it gave me an opportunity to continue that interest in the Murray, the Lower Murray, and issues around salinity. And we had projects on the Torrens, we had projects down the main stem of the river and the wetlands there. And then I was invited to do a project on the Coorong.
Yes.
Which we wrote into an Australian Research Council grant over 2 years to look at the history of the Coorong. And that itself was quite controversial because it was described as being naturally hypersaline, but we found it to be actually naturally subsaline, a mixture of freshwater and seawater, and with relatively little influence of River Murray water. In fact, there's a particular type of diatom that makes up most of the biomass of the water of the Murray. And when I looked at the data, I had a postgrad working on the diatoms in the sediments, and none of that river species was in any of the cores we took from the Coorong. And I found that puzzling. I couldn't work out, because I'd heard that the Murray River water is really important for maintaining the condition of the Coorong, but how is it that this species, and I'm still trying to work out why it's not in those sediments, but I wrote to the geomorphology professor in South Australia, Bob Borman, who's worked on the Coorong, and I said, is there some sort of barrier between the Coorong and Lake Alexandrina? That means that water in Lake Alexandrina doesn't mix with the Coorong. And he just wrote back and said, yes. Wow. And as it was, there is the last interglacial shoreline, and I'll explain that in a minute.
Please do, yes.
North of the Coorong, and it's a hard calcareous fossil dune on which they built the barrages.
Okay, you just used a word there that I'm genuinely not familiar with, calcareous.
Yeah, so it's made of calcium shell material, let's say.
Right, okay.
Shelly material and dissolved shells create a concrete. We know we put limestone to make concrete. So it's a sort of a naturally concrete dune that was 120,000 years old that actually runs along the north side of the Coorong around to Hindmarsh Island. And because it was a hard foundation, that's where they put the barrages.
All right.
So while we see the barrages as being the barrier between Lake Alexandrina and the Coorong, even before 1940, there was a natural barrage which limited the mixing of Lake Alexandrina and the Coorong. And the engineers who built the barrages identified that 70% of the flow of the Murray actually went around past Goolwa and out the mouth that way, rather than going over where the barrages are today.
We are going to end up talking about this in great detail. Obviously, because of your current work, my interest in your work is specifically around the lower lakes, the Coorong, and the implications of that for the wider Murray-Darling Basin. So I feel like I need to just orient people a little bit. Just, there are going to be people that aren't familiar with my previous work before COVID. There's a lot of people that think I'm kind of the COVID anti-lockdown guy. Well, actually, I've been a political commentator for 12 years, and the Murray-Darling Basin and water management in the Murray-Darling Basin has actually been a huge part of my work. Now, unfortunately, you can't see my pointer, so I can't actually point things out to you in StreamYard, or at least I believe that's the case. I don't believe you can see my pointer. So when we talk about the Murray-Darling Basin, Professor, how would you actually explain the Murray-Darling Basin? I mean, we're basically looking
I can actually just see your pointer, Topher, so you
can see my pointer.
You might continue pointing. I can see it, yeah.
Ah, brilliant. I didn't realize. Okay. So the Murray-Darling Basin takes in the north of Victoria, above the Great Dividing Range, where water then runs north towards the Murray River. Most of inland, or the vast majority of New South Wales. So the coast of New South Wales The water that lands there runs towards the ocean. But the vast majority of the inland area, the water runs inland over, once you get inside the Great Dividing Range, and it runs in towards, whether it be the Murray River, the Murrumbidgee River, or any one of the plethora of other rivers that then feed into the Murray-Darling system. And then into the inland areas of southwest Queensland, you also have the same thing happening, water running inland. So the Murray-Darling Basin actually takes up the majority of southern inland Queensland, the vast majority of New South Wales, northern and particularly northwestern Victoria, and a corner of southeastern South Australia as well. It is a vast geographic area. And all of that water is running and gathering into the Murray and the Darling rivers, which is why it's called the Murray-Darling Basin. And they exit all the way down here. I'm just going to zoom in here. The Murray actually comes in. It comes around through Berry, Renmark, Berry. Renmark is where Adelaide's water is extracted. Renmark, Berry, etc. Down through Walker Flat, Murray Bridge, into Tailem Bend and Lake Alexandrina. Now, what's interesting here is that ultimately, as you can see this map, now let me actually just go to this satellite rather than the map. You can see that the exit is just this little tiny thing over here. That's actually the exit of the mighty Murray-Darling River Basin into the ocean. And what you can also see in this map is that a number of barrages, so where you see this line, let me just see if I can turn off the roads here. How would I do that? Okay, I'm not going to try. But there is this grey line here, but that grey line happens to be running across the top of a barrage. That is blocking the water inside the barrage, the fresh water, from the water outside the barrage, which is saline or even hypersaline. So when we talk about barrages, we're talking about these things. When we talk about the Coorong, we're talking about this amazing stretch of water. And I'm just going to run. So we had the mouth of the Murray River is just here. And the Coorong stretches as this incredible lake, inland waterway. I don't even really know how to describe it. And it stretches and follows the coast. How many kilometers does that run for, Professor?
It's about 120 kilometers. It's what's called a back barrier lagoon.
Right.
When sea levels reached more or less their present stage, sand built up to form that seaward dune.
Yep.
And that shielded the lagoon behind the dune from the impact of.
There is also the upper and the lower lagoon separated, I believe, by this narrows just here.
Yeah, no, it's just a Narrapunka point. Yeah.
And there was a lot of water, historically speaking, and I'm sorry if I'm getting ahead of myself here, Professor, but historically speaking, this area of the very southeastern corner of South Australia, a lot of this water, a lot of this land was quite sodden and quite marshy, and the runoff would run into the Coorong. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, Professor. You know this better than I do. And all of that was diverted and no longer goes into the Coorong. Is that am I speaking correctly?
Well, yes, that's true. I've read a number of pieces by others who are more expert on this than I. But if you just look at can you see the sort of northwest, southeast lines behind the Coorong there?
Northwest, southeast
they are
lines.
A sequence of dune and swales.
Okay.
Parallel with the coast. And each of those dunes is 100,000 years older than the one to its southwest.
Okay.
So if you started at the Coorong and headed northeast, you would cross a swale, then you'd cross a dune that was 200,000 years old. Then the next dune you'd cross would be about 300,000 years old.
Right.
And that's because of the impact of the orbit of the Earth on the Earth's climate. And that forces sea levels to rise and fall by 100 meters.
Okay.
And that's the ice ages. So each ice age, the sea level fell, and you ended up with a swale. And then the sea levels rose again, and you ended up with a coastal dune. So are
these things that I'm pointing out here, is this what you're talking about?
Yes, yeah. So
sort of three of them quite clearly.
When you get a lot of rainfall in the southeast of South Australia, water sits in these longitudinal wetlands. winter wetlands, which dry out in late summer. But in the 1860s, the farmers were getting very frustrated about the fact that these wetlands stopped them getting their produce to Adelaide.
Right.
So I understand, and I don't know whether this is a true story or not, but they threatened to secede to Victoria. Of course, Victorian and South Australian rivalries being what they were and are, the South Australian government did what they could to ensure that they didn't secede to Victoria.
Of course.
And so they put in, from 1865, a series of drains, which go from A to G or however many. But effectively, it strips all the fresh water that used to land on that system directly to the ocean.
So if I can just point out
one
here,
way or another, that fresh water tended to get to the Coorong,
the Coorong itself,
flowing
and
to the northwest, ultimately getting into the Coorong to mix with tidal water, which came via a much more active and open mouth.
So would that go some way towards explaining what you were talking about before, the lack of the diatoms present in the Murray River system itself? Would the fact that there's water and there's flow coming in from these wetlands and pushing obviously towards the mouth, would that help to explain why the Murray water was not able to make its way up the Coorong?
Well, it seems as if the bulk of the Murray water made its way around via Goolwa and out the mouth that way. And tended not to come down to the Coorong. It may have acted as, that water may have acted as a means by which all water in the region rose. So the Coorong may have risen on account of the fact there was lots of river water coming through the system.
Yes,
in a hydrological pressure sense. So I'm not negating the fact that the Murray River water was important for the Coorong. And of course, the Murray River water was important for maintaining the mouth. And another surprise when we did the Coorong work was that the bulk of the species before European settlement were actually had an affinity to coastal waters, not inland salt waters.
Sorry, the bulk of the species. Which species are we talking about?
You can relate different diatom species to levels of salinity.
I see. Yes. Okay.
There's also a suite of species that will live in salty conditions on land. And other species that live in salty conditions at the coast or in the ocean.
Okay.
And a surprising number of species in the Coorong related or were of the type that spend most of their time on the coast, not inland.
Right.
So my inference from that was that tidal water was a very important component of the Coorong.
Okay.
And because other species there were what I would call subsaline, not hypersaline, so middle salinities, not salinities that exceed seawater. It suggested to me that typically the Coorong is a mixture of seawater and water coming off the hinterland, off the upper and lower southeast of South Australia, rather than being dominated by inflows from the Murray River system.
I see. So that's the Coorong that stretches along this coastline here. Now, I want to come back to that a little bit later tonight. I want to pick your brain about the Ramsar agreements and various other things like that. But I think it's worth now, having briefed everyone on the Coorong, talking about the fact that Lake Alexandrina itself is an entirely different beast to the Coorong. And what you found there is quite distinct, if I'm not mistaken, to what you found in the Coorong itself.
Well, this was the work. I handed that core I received over to my budding PhD student back in sometime in the late 90s. And she worked that up into a PhD, which she finished in 2002. And we used that LA2 core, which was just off Point Sturt. And we also went and took another core, which is just up behind where the River Murray enters below Wellington, up to the top up there. So they were the two cores she studied. And in 2006, I was overseas on sabbatical, but we agreed that we'd write up her work and the work I led on the Coorong. into a project that effectively discussed how different Lake Alexandrina was to the Coorong and how they might have evolved separately. When, if you're just looking at a map, you'd think they're all part of the same system.
Of course.
But in fact, that old fossil dune acted to keep them quite distinct in terms of their water quality, water source, and ecology.
Now, I've just realized I've jumped ahead here because there would be people watching that are sitting there going, well, this is interesting, but who cares? Why does this matter? And I wonder if you might, Peter, jump ahead and give us an explanation of why Lake Alexandrina, the barrages and the fresh water and so forth, has become such a contentious issue in the context of the Murray-Darling Basin, or the Water Act of 2007, the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. I'm just mindful that actually there's a lot of people who perhaps haven't seen my earlier work, wouldn't be familiar with your work, and may not actually understand just how real and tangible the impact of this topic is in our lives today.
So, importantly, the work that came out and was produced originally on the findings from Lake Alexandrina recognised that it was influenced by both the river and inflows of tidal water through the mouth, and so it was what would be called an estuary. And typically estuaries are saltier at the mouth and are predominantly fresh up where the river enters. But through the early 2000s, there was a strong push locally to interpret Lake Alexandrina as being always fresh. And I know that behind that interest was to argue a case that South Australia needed environmental flows to maintain it in a freshwater state.
Okay, so to put that in layman's terms, the belief that Lake Alexandrina was always fresh then was used as a justification for a political movement to insist on more of the water that landed in Queensland, New South Wales, and Northern Victoria being allowed to make its way out the end of the Murray, the mouth of the Murray, in order to maintain the Lake Alexandrina as always fresh. Is that a fair assessment?
The intermediate step there is that by 2011, there was a watering plan written for Lake Alexandrina, and effectively that said that Lake Alexandrina had to be 1,000 EC units, which is a salinity that you can't taste, 95% of the time.
Right.
Okay, and that's depending on your definition, that's just slightly above fresh.
Yeah, right.
But effectively, they were saying that Lake Alexandrina had to be fresh or as good as fresh 99% of the time. And effectively, that precluded any release of seawater into the lake, even when there was very little flow coming down the system. And under the Basin plan, that watering plan then required a certain volume of fresh water to cross the border into South Australia to get to Lake Alexandrina to maintain it in that supposedly natural fresh state.
Now, there's one other piece of the puzzle, and I'm sorry to do this to you, but I kind of just realized as I was thinking through what you were saying that I hadn't really laid all the groundwork. The other piece of the puzzle that needs to be understood is these barrages that I did mention earlier on. You can see the difference in the watercolor on either side. There's another barrage, the Goolwa Barrage here, so you can see the darker green water, the lighter green water. The ocean is cut off from Lake Alexandrina by a series of barrages. Now, they were built, if my memory serves me correctly, in the late 1930s and 1940s.
Yeah, they were in place by 1940.
They were in place. Okay, thank you. And this was essentially to guarantee that the lake would remain fresh, was it not? What was the logic? What was the thing? Why did they install them in the first place?
The South Australian Parliament were complaining about Victorians taking their water in 1887, which was before the Chaffies even started up at Redmark and elsewhere. So there was certainly very much in the eye of South Australians that Victorians were irrigating and they were taking South Australian water.
Right.
So there was great concern that the lake shifted from being very fresh to being slightly saline around about 1900. And that happened to be during a major climate shift from a lot of rainfall to very little rainfall. And there was a massive drought from 1897 to 1905.
I was about to say the Federation drought happened right at that time.
And so there were very little flows coming down that system. And so the water wasn't quite as sweet as it was for various purposes. And so it took some time, but ultimately through the 30s, they wanted to protect that water resource for various uses. And because it was verging on being too saline for those uses, they embarked upon a barrage to protect the fresh water from incoming tidal water.
Okay, I'm gonna switch which screen oh no, there it is. Okay, so this image on the top right here. Now Jennifer Marahasi was the person who first drew my attention to the reality of how the Murray does actually get, or in history, before we had the barrages, the regulated water flow, etc. Now, this is apparently at Kundruk in 1915. This is what the mighty Murray River looked like, to give you some idea of just how much, I mean, you know, in the words of, was it Keller? What was her name? The poet who talked about the land of droughts and flooding rains. You know, this is what the mighty Murray looked like. And you can appreciate from South Australia's point of view, when the mighty Murray runs dry and they're not receiving any water, they would potentially be looking upstream and saying, well, hang on, what's going on? I mean, I've got to be honest, I can have a little bit of sympathy for that particular point of view.
Yes, and it's been pointed out in various sources that the reason why it ran dry was because Victorians were irrigating and taking water for agricultural purposes.
Not sure that I believe that, but that is what is said, yes.
Yeah, so it's been pointed out that this is what the main reason why, I think in 1902, there's similar images. But I've looked to Professor Joe Powell, who only passed away a week or so ago, sadly, his book on water in Victoria. And he noted that by about 1900, 1902, while there were allocations to irrigators in Victoria, they'd all abandoned the river country because the drought was so severe. So the uptake was meagre relative to the allocation. So those that have just looked at the allocations and said this much water came out of the river don't realise that the land was actually abandoned through that drought. And it would be very difficult to, knowing that, attribute that drying of the Murray to the excesses of the irrigators on the Victorian side.
Okay, so to summarise, essentially the lower lakes, as they're known, Lake Alexandrina, Lake Albert, but primarily Lake Alexandrina, became the cause du jour and really features very heavily in the Water Act of 2007, which was the brainchild of Malcolm Turnbull and was pushed through under a Labor government, but was actually conceived under a Liberal government. So it really has bipartisan blessing. And one of the things that struck me when I read the Water Act of 2007, Professor, is the fact that it's very general in its terminology around other environmental outcomes. But as soon as it comes to Lake Alexandrina, they could name the level of salinity that was the target. They could name the AHD, the level of the lake above sea level that was the target. They were able to be very, very specific about the targets. Is it fair to say, and feel free to disagree with me, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. You tell me. But is it fair to say that Lake Alexandrina is the central focus of the Water Act of 2007?
Oh, well, I'd have to say that I haven't actually read the Water Act of 2007.
Okay. Yep.
I read lots of other things in my field, less Water
I'm
Acts.
sure you do. You're less boring than what I have to read in my field.
I have, through exploring how the water plan or the watering plan for Lake Alex came to be, it seemed that there was a very strong emphasis on using Lake Alexandrina as the principal vehicle by which South Australia could argue for water under the Basin Plan, if not the Water Act.
I would agree with that assessment. That matches my interpretation of what's happened politically. Okay, so how come your work has become quite controversial in this then? Lake Alexandrina is claimed to be fresh and it needs to be kept fresh. Therefore, they need more water to come down the Murray River from the Murray-Darling Basin. Therefore, Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria should take less to allow those flows to occur. All of that seems pretty straightforward. Why is your research now a fairly controversial part of this story and contradicted by other researchers?
Well, I left South Australia for Victoria in 2008.
Mm-hmm.
And in 2007, we'd published in an international journal that Lake Alexandrina was an estuary. And I think we had...
Meaning more saline, more...
Meaning it was a mixture, as I described before, it was a mixture of tidal water and river water.
Yeah, not mostly fresh the way it's described by others.
And that mixture was mostly river water in wet years, and it was more tidal water in much dry years. I mean,
drought
you
years.
can imagine the image you showed for 1915 that would have been a fairly strong tidal influence at Lake Alexandrina back then.
Of course.
But we know in the 1950s, when the river was running extremely high, that the bulk of the floodplain down around Wellington was actually underwater, and so Lake Alexandrina had been dominated by the fresh water coming down that system.
Sure.
And
this is that floodplain visible here around Wellington.
Work in the world. The Amazon, which has a little bit more water coming in down it than the Murray, has fresh water to the mouth and actually beyond.
Yeah.
But Australia has a very low runoff ratio on account of the very dry climate and the very dry soils, and a very variable climate relative to the large continents where the other big rivers of the world are. So it's not unexpected that this is a highly variable system. And in my mind, it's therefore was no surprise that this is the lower lakes were estuarine because of the highly variable runoff in the system. So having moved to Victoria, in 2012, one of my ex-Adelaide students alerted me to the fact that my co-authors on the 2007 paper had written a non-peer-reviewed, non-dated report that hung on the state government website, which said that Lake Alexandrina was predominantly fresh.
Okay, sorry, I need to pause because I love my audience. I love you guys, but I know there's also some newbies among you that aren't yet fully boned up on this. So I want to interpret what was just said. Professor Peter Gell and a number of other renowned scientists published a paper in 2007 based on core samples that were taken around, where was it? Around Point Sturt and around Wellington.
Point Sturt and the other one further up to the top end, yeah.
Yep. That showed, based on the fossils that are present in the sediment at the bottom of the river, that the bottom of the lake, that Lake Alexandrina at various times showed predominantly fresh and at other times predominantly saline water content. That was peer-reviewed. It passed peer-reviewed. Correct me if I'm wrong, Professor. And then can you repeat what you just said about what your co-authors on that 2007 paper went?
We also published it in 2005 as part of another study on lots of sites in the Murray. So it was actually published in two different journals, one in 2005, one in 2007.
Okay.
And in 2009, a report was lodged on the state government website, and I wasn't aware of that. I wasn't invited to participate, and I wasn't aware that it was being produced. And it contradicted the interpretation from those two published papers that went through peer review. And interestingly, it didn't actually critique the previous two papers. It just created a new interpretation.
So, in layman's terms, they didn't show why the 2005 and 2007 paper was wrong and therefore arrive at a new conclusion. They simply said, we've arrived at a different conclusion, no explanation of it.
They didn't even say it was a different conclusion. They just created a new conclusion.
A new conclusion. And these were the same authors that you had working with you on your paper, or at least some of them were.
Yes, they are all postgrads or postdocs of mine, co-authors.
You can decide if you want to answer this or not, and just flat out say, I'm not going to answer that if you don't want to. But why would that happen? Why would a researcher involve themselves in a direct contradiction of their previous conclusions without explanation?
Well, I think there are probably alternative influences on what they've done. Yeah.
We're going to leave it there because neither you nor I wants to get sued for defamation. But yes, I have looked into what you're talking about. I've read your paper, I've read their paper, and I think alternative influences is a good way to express this. Let's get to the why. Why would someone want this lake to be believed? I mean, surely it's good news. If this lake is actually estuarine and not predominantly fresh, isn't that good news? Doesn't that take the pressure off? Doesn't that mean that more water can be used for irrigation and other purposes? Why would someone have a vested interest in making sure that the scientific papers show that Lake Alexandrina was, is, and should be mostly fresh?
Well, I think we can see that with the argument about the remaining 450 gigalitres at the moment. And 450 gigalitres is a lot of water, and it's a lot of money. So the Basin Plan is delivering slowly 2,750 gigalitres, and there remains an argument over whether the remaining 450 gigalitres should be taken from the take and delivered. So South Australia has a guaranteed, on average, across years, 1850 gigalitres supply. And in a diminishing volume of water, particularly during the millennium drought, but probably ongoing into the future, there is a rather big stake that's been nailed into the sand that says that won't change. That precludes basin scale adaptation to climate and makes it very difficult, I think, for sound management of water for the 30,000 wetlands across the entire basin. The thing that concerns me is that I know from historical readings that there were mulloway, there were roughies, there were Coorong mullet, all the way up to Wellington before the barrages. And in fact, those that fished Lake Alexandrina were very concerned that they would lose that fishery if the barrages
with the
were put in
barrages.
place.
Yep.
Now you might argue that was only occurred from 1900 through to 1930, but the diatom evidence suggests that in fact those fish were probably there whenever the river wasn't a strong influence on the lake. So certainly the natural fishery was much more diverse than it is today. The stable water level and the fresh nature of that makes that one of the basin's largest carp hatcheries. And that contributes considerably, I suspect, to the poor water quality. But also it's an important site for migratory wading birds. And I've known from my younger days as a birdo that migratory waders like the tides to go up and down. So they exploit the flats when the water levels fall and they go back up to roost when the tides are high.
Sure.
And that sort of variable water level is very important for migratory waders. and it's also important for limiting the invasion of reeds and rushes in the system. And lo and behold, we have a stable water level. It's fresh, and it's dominated now by carp. It's probably suboptimal as a migratory wader habitat, and it has seen considerable expansion in terms of reeds and rushes, as identified by the grandfather of Australian coastal geomorphology, Eric Bird, in his paper in 1962.
Yeah. So I did a video. I'm just gonna bring it up here, and when we do when the bladder is busting and we all need to take a break, I might actually just play a little bit of my video from 2012. It was called the Unpopular View number 5, and it was to do with the Murray-Darling Basin, the first piece of work that I did on the Murray-Darling Basin. And I owe Professor Jennifer Marahasi an enormous amount of credit. And to my shame, I didn't give her credit in that video. I was young and stupid and didn't understand the way the world worked, and that if you're using somebody else's work, you give them credit for it. I didn't do that. So full credit where it's due. Professor Jennifer Marahasi did wonderful work on the Murray-Darling Basin. But what you'll see in that video that I did about it is exactly what you're talking about. The fact that enormous amounts of these saltwater fish were being caught in the Murray-Darling Bay, in the lower lakes at the time. The fact that the history showed us very, very clearly that depending on how much rain there was, there would be freshwater inflows, there would be saltwater, sometimes as quite far north. I mean, sharks have been seen well north of Wellington at certain times, and I do understand that happens. Okay, that's not necessarily an open and shut case, but it does happen. I mean, we've seen there are photos of sharks north of Tailem Bend, well and truly into the river itself at different times. So this is a highly variable system that we're talking about here. Now, there are, Professor, some scientists that are held in very high regard, rightly or wrongly, we can decide for ourselves, known as the Wentworth Group. Now, Wentworth is worth mentioning because Wentworth as a town is actually just up here somewhere. Now, where is that? Wentworth, there. Now, the Wentworth Group of concerned scientists would have you believe that we need to be reducing the amount of water that farmers are taking, irrigation allocations, etc., and that we need to be sending a lot more water down to South Australia. I'm summarising; they cover a lot more ground than just that particular issue. Professor, your conclusions would suggest a different policy than what the Wentworth Group are advocating for, and I'll let you speak for yourself. I don't want to put words in your mouth. How would you respond to the Wentworth Group's claims that we need to be allowing a lot more water to flow into South Australia?
Firstly, I gather the Wentworth Group were named after the Wentworth Hotel in Sydney.
Oh, were they?
And it's not to do with the town of Wentworth at all.
Is that right?
That's where they first met, I
well,
believe.
You learned something. You know what? It did strike me, because as soon as I said Wentworth, because I know the Murray quite well, I never even asked myself the question, because so much of what they bang on about is to do with water and everything else. I went, oh, well, obviously it must be Wentworth on the... I never even asked myself the question.
Yes, maybe we take that as homework.
Yeah, look, let's go away and figure that out. But actually, no, you learn something new every day. I appreciate that. And that makes a lot more sense, because these are very much latte-sipping city dwellers. And the fact that they had gone to a town like Wentworth was actually kind of impressive to me. It makes far more sense that they never did.
Well, they do actually spend a lot of time in the field. I know several of the Wentworth Group over the years.
Okay.
The thing that struck me about the lower lakes is that we are in a basin that is likely to see as much as a 50% decline in runoff with a drying climate. And we're likely to see, and we're already seeing towns in Wales, for example, that are planned to be abandoned in 2050 on account of rising sea levels.
Right.
So there are already towns around the world that are planning to move out effectively as sea levels rise. And it struck me that it seemed very curious to insist that all this fresh water gets down to a lake that was once an estuary. That's going to suffer from considerable reduction in flows due to climate change, and it's going to be hit by rising seas sometime this century anyway. And it struck me as sensible in terms of an adaptation pathways approach to map out, like the town of Fairburgh in Wales, when you're going to abandon the idea of all this fresh water going to Lake Alexandrina to keep it in its supposedly natural condition. Because the writing is on the wall as far as I can see. And there are 30,000 other wetlands in the basin. And there are 15 other Ramsar sites and icon sites and sites of significance that would well do with some of that water. And I understand the idea of a trickle effect. If you water one, then it comes out the bottom and goes down to the next one. But we have 2 to 3 meters of evaporation going down that system, and we're amongst. It's one of the few rivers in the world that gets smaller as it goes down. So of evaporation. So I don't think that's going to be a sensible approach into the future. So I know the issues around the Murray Mouth and the importance for river water to maintain the Murray Mouth. But I would suggest that the barrages have been very important in creating that the Bird Island, which is effectively a plug at the mouth, the barrages themselves. And so I struggled to see how you could justify that when so much of the basin was in desperate need of water, just in terms of the wetlands, without even arguing the case for maintaining irrigation. It was then revealed that Bruce Tom of the Wentworth Group suggested that we might need in the order of 6,300 gigalitres a year to maintain the mouth.
Which is impossible.
Then I realised that what we're arguing here is either an open Murray Mouth or an irrigation industry. And there was very little room for compromise if we were targeting 7,300 gigalitres. I've been told of the impacts of 2,750. I understand there are considerable impacts in the Goulburn system and in the Riverina already, although that's disputed by others. So I think we find ourselves very poorly prepared, recognising that we expanded irrigation at the encouragement of government through the period post-World War II when we had lots of water. And we misread the big cycles of dry and wet, and having over-allocated ourselves, we found ourselves in that extended dry. And that was not atypical to the big cycles of climate change that we've experienced. So we are very much painted into a corner, and the environment needs water. But if you are mapping out what we're going to do over the next 50 years, at some stage or another, we're going to have to let go of this idea that Lake Alexandrina must be kept fresh.
Yeah, and I think this is the key. I mean, other people are making comments here, and I actually agree with the comments. I'm not convinced that the sea level is rising the way that it's being said to rise, etc. But that's actually academic to the point of what you and I are discussing here. The reality is, whether you believe that it's rising or not, certainly if you believe that it is rising, you have to reach a point where you say we're no longer going to try and maintain this supposed status quo where it is a freshwater system and punish everyone upriver for using that water because you're costing the system downstream. Well, are you? If it's going to get overwhelmed by sea level rise, are you? You mentioned before the amount of water. Can you repeat the number? The amount of water, was it 1,650 gigalitres, something like that?
I think South Australia's allocation is 1,850.
1,850, yeah.
Gigalitres on average across years, yeah.
So water prices vary massively according to supply, demand, what season you're in, how much rainfall there's been, and also which region you're in. Different areas within the Murray-Darling Basin will attract different prices. However, I have seen prices in excess of $1,000 per megalitre. Now, a megaliter, there's 1,000 megaliters per gigaliter. So if it's $1,000 per megaliter, it's $1 million per gigaliter. If you're talking about 1,850 gigaliters, you're talking about $1.85 billion worth of water at that very high level. Now, I fully admit that's not a normal price for water. That price is the consequence of low rainfall and the Murray-Darling Basin plan taking a lot of useful water out of the system and really bleeding farmers dry. That's my opinion, not necessarily Professor Gell's. I don't want to put words in your mouth. But it gives you some measure of if there's 1.5 plus billion dollars worth of water running out the Murray-Darling, the mouth of the Murray every single year, it really does press home the importance of this question of, well, is that actually the best use for this water, especially given, as you say, if the expectation is that water levels will rise, then at some point this is going to be overwhelmed by tides. The entire Coorong is going to be overwhelmed by the ocean. The entirety of Lake Alexandrina is going to be overwhelmed by the ocean. Why are we spending so much money to defend it? Is it ecological or is it political?
Well, it's probably both. Ecologically, we like to retain systems in the condition with which we're familiar.
Mm-hmm.
And we also like to have wetlands with water in them.
Sure.
But we know from history that not all our wetlands have water in them. And
sure.
we're very poor at recognising that our wetlands need to be dry sometimes or variable. And all the way up, particularly in the Murray, the bottom half of the Murray, we're very good at stabilising both water levels and water quality
right.
as much as possible. But our ecosystems have adapted to the boom and bust, and there are very good ecologists in South Australia that have published papers with that title. So there are ecologists now that are calling for greater variability and drying phases in some of our wetlands.
Yeah, okay.
I think that's I think that would be valuable because from the work I've done higher up the system, we can see that many of these have switched because they've not been able to dry out.
Yeah, wow.
Levels all the way up the system. So I'd say more generally, we need to increase the variability, and there are governments across the basin that are endeavouring to implement greater variability in water level in the system. I'd also point out that letting water out the mouth into the offshore areas is not a waste. Our offshore areas need the elements that come in the water to function ecologically.
Okay.
We know that many offshore areas are starved of silicon because so much gets caught up in the sediments behind reservoirs. So it's very important that there be outflows from large catchments. Just to think, people say, well, there's gigalitres going out the mouth, what a waste. We could use that to grow whatever in the basin. If we're thinking broadly, then ecosystems do need water from the continents.
Okay.
But then politically, certainly, we only have to read accounts of various heated debates in hotels, in restaurants in Adelaide to know that it's a fairly political hot topic.
All right. Look, I accept your argument. There does need to be some outflows. The environment has adapted to make use of the minerals, with water content, even the reduced salinity that does occur. You look at the north coast of Tasmania, that's certainly true. There are certain fish species that breed as a result of the wet season or in the case of Tasmania, the winter outflows that happen there, etc. So I accept that premise. I'm getting a lot of questions now from viewers and many viewers, and I'm recognizing some of the usernames here that have been following me for 10 years or more. They're across the water stuff, and they're asking about your opinion, and I'm not going to make any comment so as to not prejudice your response at all. Your opinion on the concept of a Bradfield scheme, and I'm going to be specific here because the original Bradfield scheme did not involve introducing additional water into the Murray-Darling Basin. It actually involved directing water towards Lake Eyre for it to evaporate and then have a secondary increase in rainfall into the Murray-Darling Basin. However, more recent iterations have involved this idea of introducing water into the north end of the Murray-Darling Basin system, increasing flow down the Barker or the Darling River, and thereby increasing outflows and or increasing opportunities for irrigation, etc. Without me prejudicing whatsoever, what are your thoughts on this as a concept, and also, if you're willing to, on any of the specific implementations or ideas that you've seen around the concept of some variation on the Bradfield scheme?
Well, as somebody who studies algae, which are particularly sensitive to changes in water quality, I'd probably be the most resistant to any interbasin transfers of many ecologists.
Okay.
As soon as you introduce water from a different catchment, you're introducing a different chemistry.
Okay.
And the foundations of the food webs in that basin will change if the autotrophs switch on account of changing water chemistry.
Okay.
So we would need to be very careful about the impacts of transferring water from one basin to another. And all right, some basins may look like they have surplus water, but maybe their ecosystems are adapted to that seeming surplus of water. And if you remove that, then you're denying that catchment water and you're introducing water of a different chemistry to the second basin. So that would require a lot of foundational work to establish that it was would have limited impact. It's on face value would be very valuable, but I'm a bit like the cane toad seemed like to be a great idea at the time. Very wary about big schemes like that might
You're not wrong.
great
You're not wrong.
consequences.
Yeah, look, you're not wrong. I'm a big believer in humanity. I'm a pro-human, and that sometimes sets me at odds with environmentalists and conservationists. I'm a big supporter of humans reshaping the environment for our own benefit. History shows us that as we become wealthy, we actually start to look after the environment, which is a good thing. But that only happens after we become wealthy, and that requires a certain amount of reshaping of the environment to our own benefit. However, you raise a valid point. Time and time again, history tells us humans have done something smart, which has turned out to be incredibly stupid. So, look, I'm not going to debate you on the concept of a Bradfield scheme. Honestly, none of the proposed schemes right now actually appeal to me. You'll notice I haven't done a video. For those that follow me, I haven't done a video on the Bradfield scheme. You know why that is? Because I don't think any of the current proposals are actually good. And Professor Gell raises a genuine, valid point. We thought cane toads were a great idea at the time. There are people who think that, vaccine jabs are a great idea, or, specifically, mRNA jabs. I'm not anti-vaccine, but specifically mRNA jabs are a great idea at the time. History will decide whether that's actually true or not. So that's a valid point. So in terms of your work then, and taking a bit of a step back here, there are people like yourself who are saying one thing ecologically, and there are people like, whether it's Wentworth Group, whether it's UN, IPCC, etc. There's all these different bodies saying all these different things around the environment, and often conflicting. If you're willing to actually listen to all sides of the argument, you'll find a lot of different opinions on most things. The scientists don't all agree if you're actually willing to listen to the breadth of scientific opinion. How does a layman, someone like myself or the people watching, what are some of the touchstones that we can use to try and discern between good, solid, rigorous science? And let's assume that they're willing to actually read the published reports, right? Let's assume that someone is interested enough that they're actually going to read those reports. How does someone like me discern between good quality science and these people who may be, as we discussed previously, influenced by other factors? How can we discern between those two? Is there a way?
Well, it's very challenging. I'm finding that there are a lot of papers coming out advocating for particular positions that do so with a weight of evidence, but they do so without reviewing all the evidence.
Right.
In my mind, if there is evidence there that's contradictory, then you don't ignore it or dismiss it. You reconcile all the evidence.
You have to address it.
Yeah. So why is it that in some samples this happened? You can't just ignore that and sweepingly say this wetland has been fresh for 7,500, 8,000 years. That is not doing the evidence a service, I don't think. So it's a matter of doing a lot of reading, and it's a matter of listening to everyone. And I know we have these echo chambers, and I tried to get across all the papers to get a range of views. Some of them I find quite interesting, but it is, we don't all have the time. I don't have the time to keep across all the literature in my field. So if you're actually trying to in a crust somewhere out in the basin, I don't imagine you're going to have the time to get across everything. So then it becomes political, and you argue your point from the evidence you have, but you need to, if you have a point, you need to reconcile the other people's evidence against what they're saying and against what you're saying, and that's very challenging. I might say, in terms of, and I think this is an important point, you might be heading this way anyway, in terms of the Ramsar site, and I know that's a UNESCO program, and many people think they're imposing themselves on us, prescribing a particular condition. Well, that's not the case, and it's not what Ramsar was set up to do. Ramsar is essentially a means of coordinating across the world to try and assist governments to protect valuable wetlands. Critical to this site we're talking about is that the original wording under Ramsar is that a country needs to write an ecological character description at the time of listing. Okay. It needs to write it at the time of listing.
Not keep it, because I've been misinformed. I've been misinformed on this.
The ecological character that is described does not necessarily have to be the ecological character at the time of listing.
See, okay, I've been
you can write in 1985 about the character in 1945.
So,
additionally, you don't need to keep the wetland in the character as described at the time of listing, because if you did that, that would preclude any effort to restore the wetland.
Yeah.
Recognizing that Ramsar was set up in 1971 to arrest the degradation of wetlands, in full acknowledgement that wetlands were nosediving and were not in the ecological character that they were in 200 years ago. So how can we keep them in a degraded state as of 1985 in the pretense that that's what Ramsar requires us to do?
Okay, this is excellent. I've just learned something new, because I was misinformed. I was under the impression that once the Coorong was listed under Ramsar, that we were obligated to keep it in this current hypersaline state, which I do not believe, and your research is part of this. I don't believe that the current hypersaline state is historically what it used to be, and I think it would be far more ecologically beneficial to restore it back to what it used to be rather than keeping it as it is. But I've been told time and time again that because it's now listed under Ramsar, we have to keep it in this hypersaline state. Can I just be entirely clear? You're telling me that that is not what Ramsar requires us to do?
No, in 2016, we had a special issue of the Journal of Marine and Freshwater Research on Ramsar and paleoecology. And the past Deputy Secretary General of Ramsar wrote exactly that.
Okay.
So that's horse's mouth, if you like.
Yeah, no, that settles it. If it's come from there, then that settles it. Okay, that is really interesting. So why then is there this popular myth that that's the case? We have to keep it that way. Is that being propagated by the opponents of the Ramsar agreements who want to try and badmouth them, or is it being propagated by the supporters of Ramsar who are saying, look, or sorry, not the supporters of Ramsar, but the supporters of the status quo, who are looking for a reason to keep things the way they are?
Well, it's effectively wrapped around any thought that if it changes from its 1985 state, it would necessarily be a negative change.
Right.
And we very poorly understand the past or time in general, and to recognise that it was actually in a different condition 150 years ago, it is very difficult for most people. And in terms of the management processes, administrative process we have in place in Australia, it would be very difficult for, it would require South Australia to say, okay, we recognise this was once an estuary, we want to change the Ramsar listing, and then they'd have to convince the federal government that that was the case, and the federal government would have to lodge that at the meeting of parties for Ramsar. And by and large, I'm informed that it would probably just be noted at the Ramsar meeting, but domestically it would be a much more difficult row to hoe.
Yeah. So Andrew Hawley, Deniliquin Machinery, long-time supporter. Andrew, how are you? He says, do you mean hypersaline or hyperfresh? I'm talking about the Coorong, not
the Coorong's hypersaline, yeah.
Yeah, the Coorong is hypersaline. So those two systems are very, very different in their behaviour and in how the water salinity levels are.
I just want to get to some about the definition of fresh.
Please do.
This is really important, okay? So the international water science community identifies fresh as the upper limit of fresh as being 800. Okay, that's conductivity units.
Okay.
Just think of 800. Okay. Now, the River Murray at Morgan struggles to keep below 800. It's mostly above 800. Okay. So if we want Lake Alexandrina to be fresh under the international definition of fresh water, and I note that's the same definition of fresh water that came out in the State of the Environment report just a week or so ago.
Right.
Then we actually have to freshen River Murray water.
Yeah.
Because it's already too saline by the time it's at Morgan.
Yeah.
Okay. So for some reason, they use a definition that is about 2,000, I think.
Okay.
But the species they're talking about have a tolerance up to 5,000. So I've argued that in fact, the Lake Alexandrina was probably oligosaline, which meant it was the next level above fresh.
Yeah.
But when there was a big flood, it probably went to fresh.
Yeah.
And when there was a drought, it probably went above fresh. But on average, it hung around 2,000 or 3,000.
Yeah.
But at the moment, because we've identified it as fresh, we're saying it has to be below 1,500 99% of the time, which under international definition is not fresh. So the definitions are really, South Australia is using the word fresh, but insisting that it keeps at a level below what it naturally was.
Yeah.
So there's a real mix-up in definitions here.
Yeah.
And I think South Australia is trying to have it two ways.
This has become a real political hot potato, and there's a couple of sort of comments here around this. Is this argument Greens versus farmers? In this case, advantageous to South Australia fake lakers. Spending some time around the lake. I mean, it's a beautiful part of the world. I can see why the people that live there are very, very resistant to anything that would change their way of life. I mean, it's a very pretty part of the world. They've got their little yacht club there. It's a freshwater marina. I can understand why they would be very resistant to this idea of removing the barrages or what have you. But if it's true, and I don't accept that it is, but if it's true that sea levels are rising and that it's a matter of time before it's all going to have to become an estuary, a salt lake anyway, how do we communicate that? How do we actually get people to accept both the history of the lower lakes as revealed by your research, Professor, and the future of the lower lakes, if such theories are proven to be true? How do we untie the political side of this and bring it into line with the science?
That's it's going to be very difficult to unscramble. I have to say. I just presented at an international conference just recently where I contrasted the lower lakes with the Gippsland lakes.
Right.
And the Gippsland lakes were opened in 1891.
Right.
In the last decade, they've actually dredged the opening deeper.
Yep.
So they've actively increased the tidal prism in the Gippsland lakes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a Ramsar site of international significance.
Right.
And the people that use and frequent and live by the Gippsland lakes haven't objected to the increased. Well, not many of them. Most of them have not objected, if I could put it that way,
Sure.
to the increased tidal, because they're quite used to it being tidal and relatively happy at being so. The increased salinity is having a significant effect on the site. But there are many vested interests in maintaining it open and tidal. And these are vested interests that are probably no different to the vested interests that are there maintaining Lake Alexandrina as a freshwater system.
That was pretty much my assessment. I didn't quite want to put it in those words, but yes, that was pretty much my assessment when I was there. I think there's a lot of very wealthy people that have chosen to live on the lower lakes, have tremendous amounts of influence, have phone numbers of South Australian politicians in their phones, and I mean, we know that Green senators from South Australia live at the mouth of the Murray, etc. And so there's a tremendous amount of political clout there. And it's unfortunate that takes precedence over the science, especially science from someone like yourself. Can I widen this conversation out a little bit now? And actually, I've still got this book here. I had this here for my chat with Professor Ian Plimer last week because I wanted to sort of raise it there. And I'm actually I wasn't planning to do this, but I'm going to bring it up here. Do you happen to have come across Professor Ainsley Keller and his work, Science and Public Policy, the Virtuous Corruption of Virtual Environmental Science?
No, I'm not. No.
Okay, no, that's okay. That's not a slight against you. That was a question without notice, to be clear. I sprung that on Professor Gell. This idea, what he discusses, what Professor Ainsley Keller discusses, he's from the University of Tasmania. He discusses in that work the idea of virtuous corruption, the idea that there are people, and it's best recognized, I think, in policing, in prosecution. Let's say you're a police prosecutor. You're very, very sure that you've got a pedophile, a rapist, a murderer, a hideous human being. You're very, very sure that you've got them on the stand, but you don't have the evidence to get a conviction. And the temptation becomes overwhelming to maybe fudge the evidence a little bit, maybe misrepresent the evidence a little bit in order to get that conviction so that you get your man and you take that hideous, awful human being off the street. This is what's known as virtuous corruption. It's corruption. You're doing the wrong thing, but you're doing it for the right reasons. And what Professor Ainsley Keller is arguing in this book is that virtuous corruption, doing the wrong thing, misrepresenting the evidence, misstating the levels of confidence, is rife within the world of environmental sciences, particularly around where it comes to modeling and that sort of thing. What's your take on whether it's climate science, whether it's data and science and policy around the Murray-Darling Basin, the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, etc.? What's your take on this idea that there's a lot of people who are intelligent people, who are well-meaning people, but they're not necessarily being entirely honest about their work for all the right reasons, with all the right intentions, and that what laymen like myself are being told in reports, in scientific data, in the media, how reflective of that do you think is that of the actual data, the actual science?
Well, I'll just reflect on climate scientists as I know them.
Yep.
And I think most people would be completely blown away with the technology that is now helping us understand how the global climate system is changing. And all the people I've worked with do so with the utmost credibility because they know if they stepped one way, left or right, they basically undermine the whole case.
Sure.
And there's some extraordinary science that I've listened to about global climate systems, and I'll just make the point. There's a group which is a global model paleo intercomparison project, and
there's a mouthful.
They create a climate model about which many people have great skepticism, but instead of running it forward, they run it backwards.
Okay.
And they map it against the paleoclimate record. And that paleoclimate record might go back 1 million years. We have 800,000 year records at least of atmospheric gas concentrations. And they tailor the model to best fit the past climate using the drivers that they know. So there's some extraordinary science going on underpinning the models, which are telling us what we're facing. And if we go back to the 1980s and look at the forecast back then, if anything, the conditions we're experiencing today are more extreme than what are being put forward in most of the scenarios.
I'm going to disagree with you there.
The paper I put out on the lower lakes in 2019 and again in 2020 was originally to go into a special volume about advocacy and science. And there are a few papers in there that were arguing that it is justifiable to interpret your evidence if what you're seeing of the natural system is it, let's say, collapsing or becoming degraded. And so you can augment your interpretation of your evidence to strengthen your case. Now, I'm very uncomfortable with that.
Ditto.
And I go back to, and here's from a politician, Kim Carr, the Senator of Victoria, presented a keynote at our university here in Ballarat. And he reminded academics that you can stand up and say you're professor or doctor or senior lecturer or whatever and present a case to the community in as much as that's backed up by the evidence. But if you're expressing opinion, your opinion is no more authoritative than the next person. And you should be clear as to whether you're speaking on the basis of evidence or whether you're speaking on the basis of opinion.
Right there. That's it. That's it right there. So, look, you and I may have different views around whether the models from the 1980s have been borne out. I would say that our current temperatures, our average global temperatures, are off the bottom of all of the estimates from the climate change, the global warming, as they were called at the time, models coming out of the late 1980s. But look, we could debate that all night, probably fruitlessly. But where you and I do have a meeting of the minds is that the level of confidence expressed in some cases can be unjustified by the evidence. And it's you said it partway through what you were saying there, and I've forgotten the exact phrase that you used. So how do we? I guess what I'm really hoping to try and discern with you tonight is, as someone who's been on the receiving end of models, reports, scientific studies that have been put out directly contradicting your work only a few years later from some of the co-authors on your work, is there a way for lay people like myself to try and discern who do we trust and who do we not?
You trust the work that's been presented at international conferences. Because while some people might think it's a closed community, I can assure you it's fairly full and frank.
Okay.
And if you stretch your interpretation, then there's always somebody in the audience that's going to pull you up.
Okay.
So it is a very rigorous peer review process at international conferences. And similarly, I would contend that publication in high-level journals, while not infallible, generally is the means by which we ensure that the interpretation fits the evidence.
How would you, is there a way to determine a high-level journal from just an ordinary journal? Again, as a layperson, I sit here and go, someone says, oh, well, yes, this was published in XYZ. What's a shorthanded way of me actually figuring out what's the caliber of that journal? I'm not a scientist. I'm not in that world. I don't know who's who in the zoo. Is there a way to figure that out, or is that just something that has to come with time and experience?
Well, the journal's website itself will tell you what the impact factor is, and you can explore. You can explore how many times it's been cited, various websites.
Okay. We've lost you. First time in an hour and 20 minutes, by the way. Professor Peter Gell did go and get a new laptop set up for us especially, and we've had a wonderful hour and 20 minutes without interruption. Unfortunately, that's just come to an end. We've just had Professor Gell freeze on us, unfortunately. Man, that's unfortunate. Okay. So, guys, I'm gonna just fill for a couple of minutes here in the hope that his internet comes good and that we do get Professor Gell back. Unfortunately, he's just frozen on the screen, as you can see, and we can't hear him. Look, Professor Gell is a man that I have tremendous respect for. He speaks what the evidence says. He says he goes where the evidence. Oh, he's gone. He's dropped. He goes where the evidence takes him, and this is really important. I don't necessarily agree with him. You may agree with him, you may agree with me, you may disagree with us both and make up your own mind. That's not important. What's important is that Professor Gell is going to tell you what he believes to be true. That's what matters. And it's so incredibly tragic that that's actually become a rare thing in modern science today. Now, I'm not sure whether we're going to get Professor Gell back between now and, well, when I finish, which is just going to be in a couple of minutes' time. If I don't see him trying to log back in the next, say, 2 or 3 minutes, then I'm going to call it and call that a night. I suspect that he's probably lost his internet or lost his battery is probably what's happened here. So I'm just going to actually send him a message while we're chatting. I'm just going to say, you good? Or should I wrap up? Question mark. And just let him answer that when he's ready. So we need more people like Professor Gell. This is not about whether you agree, whether you disagree. This is about actually having the discussion. Now, I'm a layperson. I'm not a scientist, and I have to be very honest and with myself, very humble with myself about the limitations of my understanding in comparison to someone like him. When he comes out with his papers, when he comes out with his reports and says, this is the sample we took, this is what we found, these are the conclusions that we've drawn from that, obviously that carries an enormous amount of weight in comparison to the opinion of someone who's not actually a scientist, who's not actually living their life in that space and in that world. So Professor Gell, as you would have seen, disagrees with me on issues around climate change and sea level rise and a bunch of stuff. You need to take that into account, right? Don't just dismiss that out of hand. If you're going to dismiss that, make sure you've got a reason. Make sure you've actually spent some time and invested some energy to actually research and understand why he believes what he does and why and on what authority you're going to say, you know what, I actually think Professor Gell is wrong. Because I can tell you Professor Gell is right about a lot of things. It's my personal opinion that he's wrong about some things. But I've been 12 years in this game. You go back to 2013, 9 years ago, I was interviewing the likes of Professor Fred Singer and other highly credentialed atmospheric scientists, and I formed a different view around climate change and what might be driving it to what Professor Gell has. Do you have good reasons why you disagree? Make sure you do. I'm not saying you have to just agree with every scientist that says something, right? We know it's politicized. I'm just saying do the work. Be rigorous. Don't just have an opinion. You know, there's a funny thing. Everyone's got an opinion. You know, the saying, opinions are like assholes. Everyone has one, but that doesn't mean I want to look at it, right? We've all got an asshole. Doesn't mean I want to look at it. It's the same with opinions. And you need to make sure you have a duty of care to yourself, to your kids who you're going to influence heavily in their worldview. You have a duty of care to make sure that your opinion is not just an asshole, right? It's not just a thing that you have. It's a thing that you've actually put work into and you've invested into. And there's actually a reason why you have that particular opinion. So you can agree with me, you can agree with Professor Gell. There's many areas where we are actually in agreement with each other. You can disagree with us both. I don't care. Just have a reason. Okay, before I wrap up, I haven't had a reply yet from Professor Gell's phone, and I haven't seen him come back in. Opinions are like assholes. Everyone has one, and most of the time they're full of shit. Yes, that's exactly right. Make sure you've done the work before you decide that you've got an opinion on something. It's fine to have an opinion. Having an opinion is great. Make sure you've done the work to back that opinion up. All right, before we wrap it up here, I'm just going to repost the links to, here we go, events. I'm just going to quickly get this timed out and won't reload. Best to wrap up, I think. That's what I've just been told by Professor Gell. So I'm just going to wrap up indeed. So let me just give you the link to the premiere. Where are we? There we go. I'm just posting the link to buy tickets to the premiere of Battleground Melbourne. That's just gone into all of the various places where you might be watching. And Julie McLean says, here we go. I'm inspired to plant more trees. Thank you. Listen, looking after the environment is not a bad thing. And if you're inspired to plant more trees, plant more damn trees. It's not a bad thing. It's a very, very good thing. Arche Boise says, done my work, Topher, amateur astronomer. Good for you, mate. And there's a lot of different opinions out there, and there are justifiable reasons for a lot of those opinions. Not all of them, but for a lot of them. You take someone like, what is his name? Andrews. I'm looking for Peter Andrews, I think is his name. I'm looking forward to interviewing him about restoring the Australian landscape. He's done some incredible work around that. His opinions and his ideas are at odds with many other people's. I'm not going to decide who's right and who's wrong because I don't know, but I'm going to present both of those opinions to you and let you make up your mind around what you want to believe. I'm just going to post one more thing here, www.topherfield.net. And if you go to topherfield.net, you will be able to find at the very, very top of the blog is posted a blog there where all of the links for all of the live showings of Battleground Melbourne are going to be. I'm going to be there in person at each and every one of them. So come say hi, book a ticket, make sure you don't miss out. And I look forward to seeing you there. I have had a message from Professor Gell saying, hey, time to wrap up. His computer is timed out for some reason. It won't reload. It's just not working. So you know what? We're going to call that a night. Thank you so much for joining me. I do appreciate it. I look forward to seeing you at the Battleground Melbourne premiere. Just like what Benjamin is saying, I and the whole family will be at the Battleground Melbourne premiere. Can't wait to see it on the big screen. We'll be wearing my I Was There t-shirt. Good for you, Benjamin. I cannot wait to see you. I look forward to that. It's going to be a really, really good day. Melissa says, can I bring my DVD and poster and get them signed? Absolutely, you can. I will be there in person. If you want me to sign something, I'd be more than happy to do it. I don't know why you would want that, but if you want it, you know what? Who am I to say no? I'm going to say yes. So come along, have a great time. Thank you very much for joining me tonight. We'll be back next week with Professor Peter Ridd. We're going to be talking Great Barrier Reef. We're going to be talking Queensland farmers. We're going to be talking about the various limitations on the emissions coming from fertilizer, the very thing that has caused a revolution to be happening right now in Sri Lanka, that has caused civil unrest to be happening right now in Denmark. It's happening in Queensland. It's going to start happening elsewhere in Australia as well. I'm going to be talking with Peter Ridd about that next week. So tune in for that. Until then, have a great week and look out tomorrow for a new video, me and Rukshan having some fun doing a fake interview, just like the one you saw a couple of weeks ago. We've got one coming out this week. And from now on, this is the official launch, and we should be having one come out every single week from now on. So enjoy that, and I will see you for another solo chat with Peter Ridd next week. Thanks, guys.